Margaret's weathered cottage stood defiantly at the end of Oakwood Lane, its peeling paint and sagging porch a stark contrast to the manicured lawns and modern homes surrounding it. For decades, neighbors whispered about the neighborhood eyesore, rolling their eyes at her stubborn refusal to sell. When Horizon Developments finally convinced the elderly widow to part with her property, victory champagne was poured at the country club. The demolition crew arrived on a crisp autumn morning, ready to erase the past and make way for luxury townhomes. But what they discovered in the dusty attic stopped them cold. Leather-bound journals dating back to 1923, filled with photographs, letters, and stories of lives transformed within those humble walls. What dark secrets did those weathered pages contain that could silence even the most determined developers? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning ritual hadn't changed in 30 years. Margaret Winters, now 84, eased her aching body from bed at precisely 6:15, her arthritic fingers fumbling with the kettle for her morning tea. Through the kitchen window, autumn sunlight illuminated the garden she'd tended since. Jimmy passed in 89. Chrysanthemums and asters provided the last vibrant colors before winter's approach, their beauty visible only to her appreciative eyes. The manila envelope had arrived yesterday, another property tax assessment. Margaret didn't need to open it to know the contents. Like clockwork, the numbers climbed higher each year, a not-so-subtle pressure tactic that had already forced 3 of her elderly neighbors to sell to developers. Just a matter of time before the old bat caves, Margaret had overheard councilman Porter say at last month's town meeting. They hadn't noticed her in the back row, her small frame obscured by taller attendees. That eyesore is bringing down values across Oakwood Hills. We need young families, not crumbling relics. The tax notice joined dozens like it in a drawer beside her father's Bible. 6 decades of official papers, each demanding more than the last. Margaret sipped her tea, watching Caroline Mason power walk past the cottage, nose wrinkling slightly. As she glanced at the peeling paint, the phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Mrs. Winters? Thomas Bennett from Horizon Developments. I wanted to follow up on our conversation last week. His voice carried the practiced smoothness of someone accustomed to getting his way. At their previous meeting, he'd laid out glossy brochures showcasing Oakwood Estates, luxury townhomes with quartz countertops and smart home technology. I've been thinking about your offer, Mr. Bennett, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the heaviness in her chest. Excellent. I believe you'll find our terms more than generous, especially considering current market conditions and, well, he paused delicately, the condition of the property, not her home. Not the place where she'd raised 2 children, buried a husband, and celebrated 53 Christmases. Just an underperforming asset on a premium lot. I'll sign the papers, Margaret said, surprising herself with the finality of her decision. Bennett barely contained his excitement. Wonderful. I'll have my assistant bring everything over this afternoon. Mrs. Winters, you won't regret this. You're making the practical choice. After hanging up, Margaret walked slowly through each room, her fingers trailing along familiar walls. The kitchen where she'd taught Amy to bake bread. The living room where Jimmy had built a fire every winter. Evening. The bedroom where they'd whispered dreams in the dark. But it wasn't just her memories that filled these rooms. The cottage had stood for over a century, its walls harboring secrets few understood. Margaret climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, her knees protesting each step. The trunk sat in the corner, undisturbed for years. I'm sorry, she whispered, opening the creaking lid. Inside lay leather-bound journals. Some hers, most belonging to previous caretakers. Photographs, letters, and tokens from lives transformed within these walls. She'd protected them, continued the tradition, but now the burden had grown too heavy. That afternoon, as she signed away the cottage, Bennett's assistant avoided eye contact, perhaps uncomfortable with the elderly woman's quiet dignity. When will demolition begin? Margaret asked, her pen hovering over the final signature line. We have crews scheduled for next Monday, the young woman replied. Mr. Bennett likes to move quickly on these projects. 1 week, 7 days to say goodbye to more than just a house. Later, standing in her garden as twilight approached, Margaret realized she'd forgotten something crucial: the journals. In her emotional state, she'd neglected to retrieve them from the attic. The stories, decades of them, would be reduced to rubble alongside the cottage's weathered beams. She reached for her phone, then stopped. Perhaps this was how it was meant to end. Perhaps some stories needed to be discovered rather than explained. As darkness fell, Margaret took one last look at the cottage that had sheltered so many besides herself. "Let them find what they need to find," she whispered to the gathering shadows. The Horizon Development's conference room hummed with anticipation as Thomas Bennett strode in, 15 minutes late and radiating self-importance. He tossed a folder onto the polished table, disrupting the neat arrangement of architectural drawings. "Ladies and gentlemen, Oakwood Estates is officially a go," he announced, surveying the room with the satisfaction of a general inspecting his troops. "The Winters property is ours. Demolition starts Monday." Elise Parker, project manager for 3 years and accustomed to Bennett's theatrics, immediately began rearranging her timeline spreadsheet. At 38, she'd overseen 12 successful developments, each one larger than the last. Oakwood Estates would be lucky 13, her ticket to the executive suite. "Timeline remains tight," she said, not looking up from her tablet. "We're still pushing for model units completed by spring showcase." Beside her, Carlos Jimenez nodded. At 56, the construction foreman had been building homes since he was 16, starting as a laborer in his father's small contracting business. 20 years with Horizon had given him a weathered face and an uncanny ability to predict structural problems before they emerged. "We'll need to check the foundation thoroughly," Carlos said. "Properties that old can have surprises." Bennett waved dismissively. "Just make it disappear. I want a clean slate by Wednesday." Jake Chen, the youngest team member at 29, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Fresh from architecture school with idealistic notions about preserving community character, he'd designed thoughtful touches for the townhomes, nods to traditional elements that might help them blend with older surrounding properties. "Have we considered incorporating any elements of the original structure?" Jake ventured. "Some of these older cottages have unique craftsmanship." "Did you see the Winters place?" Bennett interrupted, projecting a photo onto the wall screen. The cottage appeared particularly decrepit from the unflattering angle. "It's an eyesore. The neighbors are practically throwing us a demolition party." He clicked to a new slide, a glossy rendering of Oakwood Estates. 12 identical townhomes, in fashionable gray stone with black trim, minimalist landscaping, 2-car garages, starting at $750,000. "This is what sells," Bennett continued, gesturing at the image. "Clean, modern, aspirational. Nobody wants Grandma's drafty cottage with outdated everything." Elise's gaze lingered on the brochure in front of her, its cover, featuring a young professional couple admiring the virtual townhomes. The woman looked disturbingly similar to herself 10 years ago, before 80-hour work weeks had become her norm. "I'll handle the permits," she said, redirecting her thoughts. "We should have final clearance by Friday." "Good," Bennett replied. "We break ground next week. Absolutely no delays." After the meeting, Carlos approached Jake at the coffee machine. "Don't take it personally, kid. Bennett doesn't do preservation. Not profitable enough." Jake sighed. "Just once, I'd like to work on something with actual character. These developments all look identical." "Welcome to corporate architecture," Carlos replied, glancing at his watch. "Speaking of which, we should head over to the Winters place for preliminary assessment. You coming, Elise?" She nodded, gathering her tablet and laser measuring tools. "Let's get this over with." The autumn afternoon had turned golden when they arrived at Margaret's cottage. Up close, Jake noted details invisible in Bennett's unflattering photographs: hand-carved porch railings, leaded glass in the bay window, stonework that had weathered a century with quiet dignity. "Kind of a shame," he murmured, running his hand along the craftsmanship. "It's just a house," Elise replied sharply, though something in her tone suggested otherwise. Carlos was already circling the structure, his experienced eyes evaluating. Foundation looks solid. They built differently back then. He paused at an odd junction between sections. Interesting. Looks like additions from different periods. Elise checked her watch. Let's get inside and document everything. I want measurements. For all rooms and structural points. As Jake followed them up the worn porch steps, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were intruders rather than professionals. The key turned stiffly in the lock, as if the cottage itself were reluctant to admit them. The interior of Margaret's cottage smelled of lavender, old books, and wood smoke, a scent Jake found unexpectedly comforting. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through dusty curtains, illuminating floating particles that danced in the golden beams. I'll start in the kitchen, Elise announced, her heels clicking efficiently across worn floorboards. Carlos, check structural integrity. Jake, document the layout. Jake moved through the living room, measuring tape in hand. Unlike the sparse open-concept designs he typically rendered for Horizon, this space felt intentional in its divisions. Small nooks created for conversation, reading corners tucked near windows, walls placed to capture light at different hours. Not standard dimensions, he muttered, noting measurements that predated building code standardization. Carlos knelt by the fireplace, examining the stonework. Hand-cut, probably local quarry. His fingers traced mortar lines with unexpected gentleness. Nobody does this anymore. In the kitchen, Elise's voice carried a note of irritation. These cabinets will need complete demolition. Nothing salvageable. Carlos continued his inspection, tapping walls and examining ceiling joists. In the hallway, he paused, frowning at the flooring. Jake, come look at this. Jake joined him, noting where Carlos pointed. The boards don't match. Exactly. Different. Wood. Different aging. Carlos knelt, running his hand over the transition. This section was modified. He pressed against a floorboard that shifted slightly. There's something here. Jake helped pry up the loose board, revealing a small cavity beneath. Carlos reached in and withdrew a yellowed envelope. What did you find? Elise called, appearing in the doorway. Carlos carefully opened the envelope, extracting a faded black and white photograph. Several men in military uniforms sat on the cottage's front porch, some with crutches or bandaged limbs. A young woman stood behind them, her hand resting on the shoulder of a soldier whose eyes stared vacantly into the distance. World War II, looks like, Jake said. Carlos squinted at the back of the photograph where faded handwriting read, Recovery Group, Winter 1945, New Beginnings at Winter Haven Cottage. Elise glanced at the image. Interesting, but irrelevant to our timeline. We need to... Wait, Carlos interrupted, his voice unexpectedly sharp. He took the photograph, studying it intently. This man, I know him. Jake leaned closer. Someone famous? My grandfather, Carlos replied quietly. Francisco Jimenez. He never talked much about the war, but he mentioned staying at a special place after coming home. Said it saved his life. Elise's professional mask flickered. Your grandfather recovered. Here? Carlos nodded slowly, still staring at the image. Shell shock, they called it then. PTSD now. He was in the Pacific. There's more, Jake said, reaching into the cavity. He withdrew a thin leather journal, its pages brittle with age. Opening it carefully, he read aloud. January 12th, 1945. 4 new arrivals today. The nightmares are worst for Captain Whitaker, who hasn't spoken since Normandy. Dr. Mills suggests music therapy, though resources are limited. Francisco shows improvement with garden work. The soil seems to ground him when memories surface. Carlos's weathered face softened. He became a landscaper after the war, worked with plants until he died. Jake turned more pages, finding additional entries documenting recovery milestones, setbacks, and small victories. This cottage was some kind of unofficial rehabilitation center for veterans. Which is fascinating, Elise interjected, but doesn't change our schedule. Bennett expects preliminary reports tonight. Jake closed the journal, noticing the name, inscribed on its cover, Eleanor Winters. Winters? Like Margaret Winters? he asked. Probably a relative, Elise replied, checking her watch. We need to finish the assessment. Carlos, check the upper floor. Jake, complete the first floor measurements. As Carlos climbed the stairs, his usual brisk pace had slowed. Jake carefully replaced the journal and photograph in their hiding place, then slid the floorboard back into position. Something about discarding his colleague's family history felt wrong. I'm heading to the attic, Carlos called down, checking for structural issues before... His voice cut off abruptly. Carlos? Elise called. Everything okay up there? His response, when it finally came, sounded strangely distant. You both need to see this, now. Jake and Elise climbed the narrow staircase to find Carlos standing motionless in the attic doorway. Dust motes swirled in the beam of his flashlight, which illuminated what appeared to be an ordinary storage space. Sloped ceilings, exposed beams, and various trunks and boxes. What is it? Elise asked, impatience edging her voice. Carlos simply pointed his light toward the far corner. There, arranged in meticulous rows on built-in shelving, sat dozens of leather-bound journals, each labeled with a year spanning from 1923 to the present. It's like an archive, Jake whispered, approaching the shelves. Carlos nodded. 100 years of history. Elise's professional detachment wavered. This complicates things. Jake selected a recent volume labeled 2018-2020 in careful handwriting. Opening to the first page, he read aloud, "The tradition continues as it must. This journal constitutes my final record as caretaker of Winterhaven Cottage, a responsibility I have carried for 45 years since Aunt Eleanor entrusted it to me in 1975. Margaret Winters," Carlos said. "This is her personal journal." Jake continued reading. "Those who find these records should understand that this cottage has never been merely a structure of wood and stone, but a sanctuary, a haven for those society overlooked or discarded. I have honored the promise made by my predecessors to maintain this place as a refuge for healing souls." Elise took the journal, scanning several pages. She writes about continuing some kind of mission that started before her time. Her eyes widened at a particular passage. Listen to this. "The council's persistent attempts to condemn the property through tax increases and code violations are nothing new. Each generation of caretakers has faced similar pressures. We persist because the alternative, losing this sanctuary, is unthinkable." Carlos opened an older volume from the 1960s. There's a list of names here, with dates and cryptic notes. Maria S., Feb-June 1962, escaping husband, talent with oils, nightmares subsiding by April. Sounds like she was helping people in crisis, Jake said, browsing another journal. Elise set down the volume she'd been examining, her expression conflicted. "This is well beyond our standard property assessment." Jake discovered a slimmer journal with Margaret's name embossed on the cover, separate from the chronological collection. Inside were personal reflections rather than caretaker records. He read silently, August 15th, 1975, Aunt Eleanor's funeral. Today, her lawyer delivered a letter afterward explaining my inheritance, not just the cottage, but the responsibility that comes with it. The journals stunned me. How could this secret history exist in the very home where I spent childhood? Summers? Eleanor's instructions were clear. Read everything, then decide whether to accept the caretaker's role or sell to someone who will continue the tradition. I have 3 months to decide. September 30th, 1975. I've read through the journals from 1923 forward. What began as a spontaneous act of kindness by my great-grandmother during Prohibition, sheltering women and children escaping alcoholic violence, evolved into something more organized. The Underground Railroad for Broken Souls, Eleanor called it. Each caretaker added their own focus while maintaining the core mission. There's more, Jake said, flipping pages to a later entry. December 20th, 1975. I've made my decision. Jimmy thinks I'm crazy to keep this old place when we could sell for a substantial sum. But he hasn't read the journals. He hasn't seen how many lives found healing here. I took my oath as caretaker today, becoming the 4th generation. The cottage is now officially mine, with all the joy and burden that entails. Carlos had found a folder containing property deeds and legal documents. According to this, the cottage has passed through the same family since 1890, always to female. Heirs. Elise checked her watch, professional mask firmly back in place. We need to document all this and report back. Bennett will want to know about these complications. Complications, Jake echoed. This is living history. It's a development obstacle, Elise corrected, though her tone lacked conviction. Carlos, photograph everything. Jake, finish measurements. I need to make some calls. As Elise descended the stairs, Jake and Carlos exchanged glances. You know what happens next, Carlos said quietly. Jake nodded. Bennett will want it all cleared out and forgotten. My grandfather would never have recovered without this place, Carlos replied, his weathered hand resting protectively on a journal. Some things shouldn't be erased. Back at Horizon's offices, Thomas Bennett's reaction was predictably dismissive. Old diaries? Photographs? You're telling me we should delay a multi-million-dollar development over some amateur historian's scrapbooks? He leaned back in his leather chair, irritation evident in every line of his face. Elise maintained her professional demeanor. We're simply reporting what we found, sir. The journals document significant historical activity. Activity nobody cared about until yesterday. Bennett scoffed. Schedule the demolition. If anything looks valuable, box it up for the local historical society. Carlos, uncharacteristically assertive, spoke up. Mr. Bennett, these aren't just random artifacts. My own grandfather recovered from war trauma in that cottage. There could be legal implications if what? Bennett interrupted. If we follow the legal sale agreement to develop property we now own? I'm sympathetic to your personal connection, Carlos. But business is business. After the meeting, Jake approached Carlos in the parking lot. That went about as expected. Carlos nodded grimly. I'm going to see my father tonight. He might remember more about my grandfather's time at the cottage. Mind if I join you? Jake asked. I'd like to understand better what we're about to demolish. Eduardo. Jimenez lived in a modest ranch house 15 minutes from the office. At 77, he maintained a meticulous garden that reminded Carlos of his grandfather's. Papa, do you remember Abuelo ever mentioning a place called Winter Haven Cottage? Carlos asked after introductions. Eduardo's weathered face registered surprise. Where did you hear that name? Carlos explained their discovery, showing the photograph on his phone. Eduardo's eyes widened. Dios mío, he whispered, taking the phone with trembling hands. That's him. That's my father when he came back from the Pacific. He stayed at this cottage? Jake asked gently. Eduardo nodded, eyes distant with memory. For almost 6 months. He couldn't live with us at first. The nightmares, the rage, the drinking. The VA hospitals were overflowing. He pointed to the woman in the photograph. This woman, Miss Eleanor, she ran a place for soldiers who needed quiet and time. Not an official hospital, just a sanctuary? What happened there? Carlos asked. Eduardo retrieved a small wooden box from his bookshelf. Inside lay a Bronze Star medal and several yellowed letters. My father couldn't speak about the war for years, but he wrote to my mother from Winter Haven. Eduardo carefully unfolded one letter. He says here, Miss Eleanor doesn't force us to talk. Some days we just garden or repair things around the cottage. Other days, when the memories come, she sits with us. No doctors, no schedules, just quiet understanding. For the first time since Okinawa, I slept through the night. Jake examined the medal. He was decorated? Eduardo nodded. For saving 3 men under fire. The brave man who left for war never really came home, until Winter Haven helped him find pieces of himself again. Carlos's voice was thick with emotion. Why didn't you ever tell me this? Your grandfather didn't want to be defined by his broken time, Eduardo said simply. But he kept this his whole life. He handed Carlos a small, smooth stone with the word peace painted on it. Miss Eleanor gave each man a stone from the garden when they were ready to leave, a reminder to stay grounded when memories surfaced. He held it during every thunderstorm until he died. On the drive back, Jake was uncharacteristically quiet. Finally, he spoke. You know what this means. Carlos nodded. The cottage wasn't just my grandfather's story. There must be hundreds more. I want to check something, Jake said. Can we stop by the County Historical Society before they close? The Historical Society occupied a former Victorian mansion downtown. Marjorie Keller, the elderly archivist, perked up at their questions. Winter Haven Cottage? Oh my, that takes me back. She disappeared into the archives, returning with a slim folder. We don't have much, but there was a small newspaper piece from 1947. The yellowed clipping showed a group of men working in a garden, faces averted from the camera. The headline read, Local Home Provides Quiet Recovery for Veterans When Hospitals. Overflow. The article mentions at least 40 men finding peace and purpose there between 1944 and 1947, Marjorie explained. Quite revolutionary for its time. No clinical approach, just calm routine and meaningful work. Was it ever officially recognized? Jake asked. Never, Marjorie replied. Just a quiet effort by a remarkable woman. The Winters women have always been ahead of their time. Leaving the Historical Society, Carlos called Elise. We've found confirmation. The cottage was a significant rehabilitation center for veterans, including my grandfather. I'm sending documentation. Jake added, Tell Bennett this changes everything. Thomas. Bennett's arrival at the cottage the following morning was heralded by the aggressive purr of his Jaguar's engine. He emerged in a tailored suit that seemed deliberately out of place among the autumn leaves and weathered siding. This better be worth interrupting my breakfast meeting, he announced, navigating around puddles from the previous night's rain. Elise met him on the porch, tablet in hand. Thank you for coming, sir. We've organized our findings systematically. Inside, Jake and Carlos had arranged key items on the dining room table, journals open to significant entries, the veteran photographs, newspaper clippings, and a timeline. They'd worked on until midnight. Bennett barely glanced at the display. I've reviewed your emails. While this historical hobby project is charming, we have contractual obligations with buyers. Pre-sales begin next month. Sir? Carlos began carefully. This isn't just about history. My grandfather... Yes, your grandfather recovered here. I understand the personal connection, Carlos. Bennett's tone softened momentarily before hardening again. But one family story doesn't justify scrapping a $15 million development. Jake stepped forward. It's not just one family. We've documented at least 40 veterans from World War II, another 30-plus women escaping domestic violence in the 50s and 60s, and numerous artists and writers who found refuge here when they had nowhere else to go. Which is why, Elise interjected, we've prepared alternatives that preserve elements of... Alternatives? Bennett's eyebrows shot up. Who authorized alternative plans? An uncomfortable silence filled the room. I did, Elise finally answered. As project manager, it's my responsibility to identify potential obstacles and propose solutions. Bennett's expression darkened. The only obstacle I see is a team that's forgotten who signs their paychecks. He turned to Carlos. The demolition schedule stands. Monday morning, 8 a.m. After Bennett stormed out, Elise's phone chimed with an email notification. She read it silently, her face paling. He's threatening to replace the entire team if we don't resolve our sentimental attachment issues by tomorrow. She showed them the screen. He's already contacted Weston Group about taking over construction if necessary. Carlos shook his head. 20 years with this company, and he'd replace me over this? He would, Elise confirmed. And there's more. He's expedited the demolition permit. They're coming tomorrow instead of Monday. Jake slammed his hand on the table. That's not enough time to properly document everything. It's deliberately not enough time, Elise said quietly. He wants this problem to disappear. The three stood, in somber silence, surrounded by the evidence of lives transformed within these walls. Finally, Carlos spoke. I have 3 kids in college and a mortgage. I can't lose this job. He looked at the photograph of his grandfather. But I also can't be part of erasing this place. Jake nodded in understanding. My position is more flexible, but still, we need to be strategic, Elise said. Her project. manager instincts taking over. Bennett responds to financial incentives, not emotional appeals. If we could demonstrate tangible value, historical designation would force a review, Jake suggested. Which takes weeks we don't have, Elise countered. Carlos had been quiet, thumbing through one of the journals. There's something here about a hidden room, a space they used during Prohibition and later for the Underground Railroad. Jake's eyes widened. If we could find physical evidence of Underground Railroad activity, that would trigger an automatic historical review, Elise finished, a spark of hope in her voice. Federal regulations would supersede local permits. They spent the next hour searching for clues in the journals, finding references to a sanctuary beneath and the hidden passage. We need to find this room before tomorrow morning, Carlos said, checking his watch. But I've got a meeting I can't miss at 1. I'll keep looking, Jake volunteered. Elise hesitated. I have the quarterly review presentation to finish. Her voice trailed off as she glanced at the journals. With sudden resolve, she set down her tablet. Bennett can wait. This can't. As Carlos left for his meeting, his phone buzzed with a text from Bennett. Team meeting, 9 a.m. tomorrow. Final decision on Winter's property. Your continued employment depends on alignment with company objectives. Ensure your personal attachments don't cloud professional judgment. Carlos showed the message to Elise and Jake. He's not even trying to be subtle anymore, Jake muttered. Then neither should we, Elise replied, rolling up her sleeves. Let's find that hidden room. Jake ran his hand along the kitchen wainscoting for the 3rd time, searching for any irregularity that might indicate a hidden passage. Elise methodically measured dimensions, comparing them to the original floor plans they'd found in the county records. The proportions don't add up, she murmured, double-checking her calculations. There should be another 3 feet between this wall and the exterior. Jake tapped the wainscoting, listening for hollow spaces. According to the 1850s journal, Sarah Winters mentioned a narrow path to freedom beneath the hearth and heart. Poetic, but not exactly precise directions, Elise replied, frustrated. They had been searching for hours. Carlos had returned from his meeting and was now in the cellar, examining the foundation stones. Hearth and heart, Jake repeated, staring at the kitchen. The hearth is obviously the fireplace, but what's the heart of a home traditionally? The kitchen, Elise answered, her eyes widening. Not the living room fireplace, the kitchen hearth. They hurried to the antique cast-iron stove that stood against the back wall. Jake ran his fingers along its seams. Help me move it, he said. Together, they carefully pulled the heavy stove away from the wall, revealing nothing but decades of dust. Another dead end, Elise sighed. Jake knelt, examining the floorboards. Wait. He brushed away dust, revealing a subtle difference in the wood grain. These boards are newer than the others. Carlos appeared in the doorway, wiping dirt from his hands. Find something? Maybe. Jake pressed on different sections of the floor until they heard a faint click. One board shifted slightly. Carlos joined him, and together they pried up the loose board, then another beside it. Beneath was a small iron ring. A trapdoor, Elise whispered. Carlos pulled on the ring, lifting a section of flooring to reveal a narrow wooden staircase descending into darkness. I'll get the flashlights, Jake said, his voice hushed with anticipation. Moments later, they carefully made their way down the creaking steps into a small, earth-floored room about 8 feet square. Their flashlight beams revealed whitewashed stone walls and a low ceiling supported by hand-hewn beams. It's real, Elise breathed, her professional detachment momentarily forgotten. Carlos examined the construction. Pre-Civil War masonry techniques. This was built when the cottage was first constructed. Jake's flashlight illuminated a small shelf holding several artifacts, a rusted lantern, a crude tin cup, and a small wooden box. He carefully opened the box to find a collection of buttons, a thimble, and what appeared to be a hand-drawn map. These could have belonged to freedom seekers, he said. Elise pointed her light at the far wall, where faint markings were etched into the stone. Look at these symbols. The markings resembled simplified stars, birds, and directional indicators that matched known Underground Railroad code symbols. This confirms it, Carlos said. Winter Haven was a station on the Underground Railroad. Jake examined the walls more carefully. There's a brick that's different from the others. He pressed it, and to their amazement, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow tunnel. It must connect to the old creek bed behind the property, Carlos said. A escape route if slave catchers came to the house. Elise was already documenting everything with her tablet. This changes everything. Federal preservation laws protect Underground Railroad sites. Bennett can't touch it now, Jake added, relief evident in his voice. They spent the next hour photographing and measuring every detail of the hidden room. As they climbed back up to the kitchen, Elise was already drafting an email to the State Historical Preservation Office. "We need to move quickly," she said. "The demolition crew arrives at 8 tomorrow. I know someone at the Black Heritage Historical Society," Carlos offered. "She's an expert on Underground Railroad sites in this region." "Call her," Elise nodded. "We need all the expert verification we can get." Jake carefully replaced the trapdoor and floorboards. "Should we tell Bennett?" "Not yet," Elise decided. "Let's get the Historical Society representatives here first. Once they've documented everything, officially, Bennett won't be able to accidentally destroy evidence." As they were securing the site, Carlos's phone rang. The caller ID showed local news. "Hello?" he answered cautiously. "Mr. Jimenez? This is Rebecca Chen from Channel 7 News. We received an anonymous tip about historical discoveries at the Winters property. Is it true that Horizon Developments is planning to demolish a confirmed Underground Railroad site?" Carlos looked at his colleagues in shock. Someone had leaked their discovery. "How did they find out so quickly?" Jake whispered. "I don't know," Carlos replied, covering the phone. But this just became very public, very fast. Elise's expression was a mixture of concern and calculation. Good. The more witnesses, the harder it will be for Bennett to make this disappear. By evening, the cottage had become the center of unexpected attention. Dr. Amara Washington from the Black Heritage Historical Society arrived with 2 colleagues, carefully documenting the hidden room and its artifacts. Channel 7 News had set up a van outside, with Rebecca Chen reporting live for the evening broadcast. "We're standing in front of what appears to be more than just an old cottage," Chen said into the camera. "Historical experts are currently investigating evidence that this property, scheduled for demolition tomorrow, was once a station on the Underground Railroad." Inside, Elise managed the growing crowd of historians and preservationists while fielding increasingly angry calls from Bennett. "This is a publicity stunt," he fumed through the speakerphone. "You've invited media vultures onto private property without authorization." "Sir, we didn't contact the media," Elise replied calmly. "And these aren't vultures. They're certified historical experts documenting potentially protected historical evidence." "I'm sending security to clear the property," Bennett threatened. "That would make for interesting television," Elise countered. "Channel 7 is broadcasting live." The line went silent before Bennett spoke again, his voice coldly controlled. "This changes nothing. I'll see all 3 of you in my office at 7 a.m. While the Underground Railroad connection commanded attention, Jake continued exploring the journals, finding himself drawn to entries from the 1930s. He sat in Margaret's reading nook, poring over a worn ledger book with careful columns of numbers and names. "Carlos," he called, "take a look at this." Carlos joined him, examining the ledger. "Looks like financial records. Not just any records. This lists hundreds of meals served between 1931 and 1936. Jake pointed to the careful notations. "During the height of the Depression, someone named Catherine Winters was running a soup kitchen from this cottage." Carlos whistled softly. "How many meals?" "According to these tallies, over 15,000 over 5 years. Jake turned to a different journal from the same period. "Listen to this entry from December 1932. 37 souls fed today despite the snow. Mr. Harrington from the bank suggested again that I sell the property to cover my debts. He cannot understand that this house serves a purpose greater than my comfort. As long as I have a kitchen and garden, no one in this town will starve on my watch." Inspired by the discovery, they searched a nearby trunk, finding a weathered recipe book with dozens of economical dishes, stretching soups, simple breads, and preservation methods. She was feeding people when she could barely keep the cottage. Herself, Jake said, showing Carlos a property tax notice from 1933 marked Final Warning. Dr. Washington overheard their conversation and joined them. The Depression hit Black communities particularly hard. Were there any mentions of who was being fed? Jake flipped through the journal, finding a relevant passage. The colored families from Riverside come on Thursdays, when the town relief office is closed to them. The Miller brothers tried to intimidate me for this, but I reminded them that my late husband employed half the town before the crash. They left without further complaint, though I expect more trouble. Remarkable, Dr. Washington said. She was deliberately countering segregated relief efforts. A commotion at the front door drew their attention. An elderly man with a cane had arrived, insisting on entry despite the late hour. Please, he was saying to a preservationist blocking his way. I need to see it one more time. Carlos approached him. Sir, can we help you? The man's weathered face brightened. My name is Harold Fisher. I heard on the news about Winter Haven Cottage. His voice quavered with emotion. My family would have starved in 33 if not for Miss Catherine's kitchen. I was just a boy, but I remember coming here every Tuesday and Friday. Jake brought him inside, showing him the kitchen. Harold's eyes filled with tears as he ran a gnarled hand along the old stove. Right here, he whispered. She'd always make sure us kids got extra bread. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small, faded photograph. This is my mother and me standing right out front, winter of 33. The photograph showed a line of gaunt-faced people waiting patiently in the snow, the cottage visible in the background. May I scan this for our records? Dr. Washington asked gently. Please. Harold nodded. People should know what happened here. As word spread, more elderly community members began calling and arriving, eager to share memories of Miss Catherine's kitchen. Each story added another layer to the cottage's significance, not just as a historical site, but as a living memory in the community's consciousness. Watching the growing crowd, Elise made a decision. She stepped away and called Bennett back. Sir, I think you should come see this yourself. The situation has evolved. Morning brought no relief from the growing storm surrounding Winter Haven Cottage. Bennett had texted the team that their 7 a.m. meeting was postponed, but the demolition crew remained scheduled for 8 a.m. News vans from 3 additional stations had joined Channel 7, and a small crowd of protesters with hastily made Save Winter Haven signs gathered at the property edge. Jake had barely slept, spending most of the night documenting findings with Dr. A. Washington's team. Fueled by coffee and growing indignation, he returned to the attic, determined to uncover more before the deadline. There must be something else, he muttered, examining the journals from the 1960s. The entries from Eleanor, Winters, Margaret's aunt, were more detailed than earlier caretakers, with eloquent observations about her guests. One name appeared repeatedly. MS, March 15, 1962. MS arrived today with nothing but a small suitcase and bruises she tried to hide with makeup. Her husband found her previous hiding place. Says he'll kill her if she tries to leave again. She's terrified but also angry. There's a fire in her that hasn't been extinguished. When she saw my watercolors, something changed in her expression. Tomorrow, I'll show her the studio space in the attic. April 2nd, 1962. MS has been painting nonstop for 3 days. Remarkable talent. The images are disturbing but powerful. Dark figures reaching through doorways, women with faces hidden behind masks. She says painting helps her get it out before it poisons her. Jake followed the entries through the summer of 1962, tracing the mysterious MS's recovery and eventual departure to New York City with a portfolio of work. The final entry mentioned a promise to stay in touch and Eleanor's quiet pride in helping launch what will surely be an important artistic voice. The initials nagged at Jake's memory. On a hunch, he searched MS Painter 1960s on his phone. The results made him gasp. Carlos, Elise, you need to see this. They rushed to the attic, finding Jake surrounded by printouts of artwork that looked eerily similar to sketches they'd found in the cottage. Maria Santos, Jake said breathlessly, one of the most celebrated feminist artists of the last century. Her first major exhibition in 1965 stunned the art world with its raw depictions of domestic violence and female resilience. He held up his phone, showing a photograph of a severe-looking woman with intense eyes. She died last year at 84, after decades of acclaimed work. And she got her start right here. Carlos examined the journal entries. Eleanor Winters gave her refuge when she was escaping an abusive husband. Jake nodded excitedly. There's more. In a 1990 interview, Santos mentioned a sanctuary where a kind woman saved my life and gave me space to find my voice. She never named the place, saying she had promised to protect its location so it could remain a haven for others. That's compelling, Elise admitted, but we need something concrete that ties her directly to this cottage. Jake's expression fell. You're right. These journal entries prove Eleanor's side, but nothing confirms Maria was actually here. As if, responding to his frustration, a floorboard creaked beneath his shifting weight. Jake froze, then pressed deliberately on the spot. Again, the distinctive sound of hollowness. Another hidden space, Carlos said, already reaching for tools. Together they carefully pried up the loose board, revealing a narrow compartment. Inside lay a flat package wrapped in oilcloth and tied with faded ribbon. Jake gently unwrapped it, revealing a canvas, roughly 16 by 20 inches. The painting showed a window, this very attic window, with a woman's silhouette looking out at a stormy sky. Though unfinished, the technique was unmistakable. It's a Santos, Jake whispered. Has to be. A folded paper had been tucked behind the canvas. Jake opened it carefully to reveal a handwritten note. Eleanor, I cannot take this piece with me. It's too raw, too revealing of where I've been hiding. Perhaps someday I can reclaim it, when I'm safe and he's no longer looking. Until then, keep it as a thank you for saving my life. The world may never know what you've done for me and others, but we know. We carry your sanctuary in our hearts. Maria Lees immediately began making calls. We need an art expert here now. Within an hour, Dr. Lydia Chen, curator from the State Art Museum, arrived to examine the painting. Her hands trembled slightly as she used gloved fingers to inspect the brushwork. The composition, technique, use of light. It's unmistakably early Santos, she confirmed. This is an extraordinary find. Her work from this period is extremely rare since most was destroyed by her husband before she escaped. What's it worth? Carlos asked. Dr. Chen laughed softly. Monetarily, millions potentially. Historically, priceless. This represents the turning point in the career of one of our most significant artists. As they carefully documented the painting, Jake couldn't help but wonder, how many other lives were transformed here that we still don't know about? Carlos checked his watch. It's 7:50. The demolition crew will be here in 10 minutes. Let them come, Elise said with newfound resolve. I think we're ready for them. The demolition crew arrived to find their path blocked by a crowd that had swelled beyond anyone's expectations. Overnight, social media had transformed Sheer Save Winter Haven from a local curiosity into a trending topic. Residents who had previously complained about the cottage now stood shoulder to shoulder with preservationists, historians, and news crews. I've been instructed not to comment, the foreman told Rebecca Chen as cameras rolled. We're just here to do a job. His discomfort was evident as he radioed his supervisor for instructions. Thomas Bennett arrived minutes later, his Jaguar cutting an aggressive path through the gathering. He emerged looking uncharacteristically disheveled, his normally impeccable suit wrinkled from what appeared to be a sleepless night. This is private property, he announced to the crowd, voice strained to maintain authority. Anyone not authorized by Horizon Developments must leave immediately. Mr. Bennett, Rebecca Chen approached with a microphone, would you like to comment on reports that your company plans to demolish a historically significant underground railroad site and former sanctuary for domestic violence victims? Bennett's expression tightened. There have been some findings that require evaluation. Horizon Developments is committed to responsible development that respects community heritage. The practiced corporate response fell flat against the backdrop of demolition equipment. Inside the cottage, Elise, Jake, and Carlos watched the scene unfold. "He's trying to control the narrative," Elise observed. "But it's too late for that." Carlos nodded toward the window where Caroline Mason, the power-walking neighbor who had wrinkled her nose at Margaret's cottage, now stood with a handmade sign reading, "Preserve Our History." "Amazing how quickly people change when they have all the facts," he remarked. "Or when supporting preservation becomes the socially advantageous position," Elise added cynically. Jake had been reviewing old newspaper clippings they'd found in Margaret's files. "Look at this," he said, spreading out yellowed pages on the table. "The Oakwood Lane Chronicle from 1975 to 2020. Margaret kept every article that mentioned the neighborhood. The clippings chronicled the area's transformation from a mixed income community with small businesses to an exclusive enclave of increasingly expensive homes. Photographs showed the gradual disappearance of older structures, replaced by larger, more imposing residences. The cottage was the last original building," Jake observed. "Everything else has been demolished, or so heavily renovated it's unrecognizable." A knock at the door interrupted them. A middle-aged woman stood on the porch, clutching what appeared to be a child's drawing. "I'm Linda Pearson," she introduced herself. "I grew up 3 houses down in the 1970s. She held out the faded crayon drawing. "I made this when I was 8. It's Mrs. Winters, Margaret, and her cottage." The childish rendering showed a smiling woman beside a purple house with exaggerated flowers. "She used to let all the neighborhood kids play in her garden," Linda continued. "She taught us about different plants and birds. When my parents divorced, I spent hours here while Mom was working. I just heard on the news what they found in this house, and I had to come." Throughout the morning, more neighbors arrived with similar stories. An elderly man who delivered groceries to homebound residents during blizzards using Margaret's garage as a distribution center. A woman whose daughter had found refuge at the cottage during a mental health crisis in the 1990s. A retired teacher who recalled Margaret quietly providing school supplies for children from struggling families. By noon, the cottage's front yard had become an impromptu community gathering. People shared memories, examined historical materials displayed by Dr. Washington's team, and signed a hastily organized petition. Among the visitors was Councilman Porter, the same official who had dismissed Margaret as the old bat at the town meeting. He approached Jake, who was showing the Underground Railroad room to a group of high school students. "Remarkable discovery," Porter said, extending his hand. "The town council is very interested in exploring preservation options." Jake didn't bother hiding his skepticism. "The same council that's been raising her property taxes to force her out?" Porter had the grace to look embarrassed. "We didn't have all the information before. This changes the equation considerably." Outside, Bennett was engaged in an intense phone conversation, pacing near his car. When he finished, he approached the demolition crew foreman with instructions that sent the heavy equipment retreating down the street. Elise's phone rang. It was Bennett. "Parker." His voice was clipped. "The board has called an emergency meeting. Demolition is temporarily suspended. Keep the site secure." He paused. "And bring everything you found. Everything. 3 o'clock. Main conference room." As she shared the news with Carlos and Jake, a cautious optimism spread through the team. "It's not over," Carlos warned. "No," Elise agreed. "But Bennett doesn't retreat unless he's planning a different attack." Jake watched as more community members arrived, some bringing food, others setting up chairs for elderly visitors. "Whatever happens. Next," he said, "the cottage isn't invisible anymore." The Horizon Development's boardroom exuded corporate sterility. All glass, chrome, and strategic views of downtown. Elise, Carlos, and Jake sat on one side of the massive table, facing Bennett and 5 board members. The evidence they'd gathered from Winter Haven Cottage was arranged before them. Journals, photographs, the Maria Santos painting, now secured in a proper art transport case, and a thumb drive containing digital documentation. "Let's be clear about our position," Bennett began without preamble. Horizon legally purchased the Winters property. We have valid permits. The sentimental value of old journals doesn't invalidate our rights. A silver-haired woman at the end of the table, Patricia Mercer according to her nameplate, leaned forward. Thomas, this isn't about sentimentality anymore. The Underground Railroad connection alone triggers federal preservation review statutes, which could take months, Bennett countered. Meanwhile, we have contracts with buyers, construction schedules, and financial commitments. And a public relations nightmare, added board member Lawrence Whitney, gesturing toward his tablet displaying news coverage. The optics of demolishing a documented historical site are problematic. Elise cleared her throat. If I may, we've prepared an alternative development plan. She distributed folders containing Jake's hastily revised designs. This approach preserves the cottage as a community historical center while still developing the remaining property with 8 luxury townhomes. 8 instead of 12, Bennett pointed out sharply. Quality over quantity, Elise countered. These 8 would be positioned as exclusive residences with historical significance, commanding premium prices. There's precedent for this approach succeeding financially, Jake added, showing comparable developments where historical preservation had enhanced property values. The board members examined the proposal with interest, but Bennett remained unmoved. We've already filed the demolition permits, he insisted. Which I've officially challenged, announced a new voice from the doorway. All heads turned to see a woman in her 50s wearing a tailored suit and carrying a leather briefcase. Behind her stood Dr. Washington and an older man in a bow tie. Catherine Winters Sullivan, she introduced herself. Margaret Winters is my aunt. I'm an attorney specializing in historical preservation law, and I've just filed an emergency injunction against the demolition permits. Bennett's face flushed. This meeting is private. Security. Board member Patricia Mercer raised her hand. I invited Ms. Winters Sullivan. As legal counsel for this board, I felt it prudent to hear all perspectives. Catherine set her briefcase on the table. Dr. Washington, you've met. This is Professor Emeritus James Hargrove, State Historical Society. Chairman. She distributed legal documents to everyone present. This emergency filing cites 3 distinct grounds for historical preservation: documented Underground Railroad activity, cultural significance during the Great Depression, and artistic heritage regarding Maria Santos. The property transaction was legal, Bennett insisted. Mrs. Winters sold willingly. My aunt sold under duress after systematic pressure from rising property taxes that this company lobbied for through substantial donations to certain council members, Catherine countered. Furthermore, she was not of sound mind regarding the historical significance of the property. Are you claiming dementia? Bennett scoffed. No, Mr. Bennett. I'm stating that recent medical evaluations indicate Margaret suffers from early-stage Alzheimer's. She forgot the historical significance she was entrusted to protect. A heavy silence fell over the room. We had no knowledge of Mrs. Winters's condition, Patricia Mercer finally said. Which is why we're not pursuing claims of predatory practices, Catherine replied. We simply want to preserve the site. The injunction has already been granted. Demolition cannot proceed until a full historical review is completed. Bennett slammed his fist on the table. This is a delay tactic. It's the law, Catherine corrected calmly. Additionally, the town council has called an emergency session for tomorrow evening to consider local historical designation. Professor Hargrove spoke for the first time, his voice gentle but authoritative. Winterhaven Cottage represents a remarkable continuum of humanitarian service spanning generations. From sheltering those escaping slavery to supporting veterans, feeding the hungry during economic collapse, protecting victims of domestic violence, and nurturing artistic talent, it embodies our community's highest values. Some structures transcend mere property value. This isn't over, Bennett warned. No, Catherine agreed. The legal process is just beginning, but demolition is off the table for now. After the meeting, Catherine approached Elise, Carlos, and Jake in the lobby. Thank you for what you've done, she said sincerely. If not for your discoveries, everything would have been lost. We were just doing our jobs, Carlos replied uncomfortably. Catherine smiled. No. You chose conscience over convenience. That's rare these days. She hesitated. Would you be willing to come with me to visit Margaret? I think she should know what you've found, while she can still understand it. The three exchanged glances before Elise spoke for them all. We'd be honored. Oakridge Senior Living Center resembled an upscale hotel more than a care facility, with tasteful furnishings and attentive staff. Catherine led the group down a sun-filled corridor to a private room where Margaret Winters sat by a window, a half-finished knitting project in her lap. At 84, Margaret retained the straight posture and clear gaze that had once intimidated town council members. Her silver hair was neatly styled, her cardigan buttoned precisely. Only the slight confusion in her eyes as they entered betrayed her condition. "Aunt Margaret," Catherine said gently, "I've brought some friends who want to talk about Winter Haven." Margaret's expression shifted from polite distance to sharp focus. "Winter Haven? You mean the cottage?" "Yes," Catherine nodded. "These people have discovered some of its secrets." Margaret studied each face carefully before her gaze settled on Carlos. "You look familiar." "My grandfather was Francisco Jimenez," Carlos explained. "He recovered at Winter Haven after World War II. Margaret's eyes widened. "Francisco, the gardener. He had such gentle hands with the seedlings." She smiled at a memory only she could see. Eleanor said his nightmares stopped once he started working with the roses. Catherine placed a canvas tote bag on the bed. "Aunt Margaret, they found the journals. All of them." Margaret's hands trembled slightly. "All of them? Even—" "Yes," Jake confirmed. "The Underground Railroad room, the Depression-era kitchen records, Maria Santos's painting, everything." Margaret closed her eyes briefly, her relief palpable. "I thought they were lost. When the memory problems started, I couldn't remember if I'd moved them or told anyone." Her voice trailed off before strengthening again. "I broke the caretaker's oath by selling. But the taxes? They kept rising, and I got confused about which bills were paid." "You didn't break anything," Catherine assured her. "The tradition continues." From the tote bag, Catherine removed a small wooden box inlaid with mother of pearl. Margaret's face brightened. "You found it. In your nightstand drawer," Catherine confirmed. "Just as you told me years ago." Margaret accepted the box reverently, her fingers tracing the inlay pattern. "There's something I need to show you all." She opened the box to reveal a tarnished brass key and a small leather-bound book. "This is the original key to Winter Haven, passed from caretaker to caretaker since 1890. Elise leaned forward. "The property records only go back to 1923. The cottage is older?" "Much older," Margaret nodded. "Built before the Civil War by my great-great-grandmother, Abigail Winters. She was a conductor on the Underground Railroad." She removed the key, its brass gleaming in her palm. "This opened the original cottage door, though the locks have been changed many times since." "And the book?" Jake asked. "The first journal," Margaret replied. "Abigail's account of creating the sanctuary." She handed it to Catherine. "It explains everything, how the tradition began, the oath each caretaker takes, the true purpose of Winter Haven." Catherine opened it carefully, reading aloud. "I established this dwelling not merely as shelter for my family, but as sanctuary for souls in peril. Let these walls harbor the hunted, comfort the broken, and strengthen the weak. Let no authority, no convention, no fear prevent this place from serving those whom society has abandoned. I bind my daughters and their daughters after them to this purpose until the world no longer requires such havens, a day I shall not live to see." Margaret nodded. "Every caretaker takes that same oath. We become part of something larger than ourselves, a continuous thread of compassion stretching across generations." "But why keep it secret?" Carlos asked. "Sanctuaries can only protect the vulnerable if their purpose remains hidden from those who would do harm," Margaret explained. "Runaway slaves, battered women, traumatized veterans, all needed anonymity to heal." "The secrecy makes sense historically," Elise acknowledged. "But now those very secrets might save the cottage." Margaret straightened, her voice suddenly stronger. "I want to see it. Before anything else happens, I need to go home once more." Catherine looked concerned. The doctor said— I know what the doctor said, Margaret interrupted. But this is more important than my comfort. The cottage is in transition between caretakers. I must be there. The resolve in her voice brooked no argument. Catherine sighed, then nodded. Tomorrow morning, then, if you're feeling strong enough. Margaret's fingers closed around the brass key. I've never needed physical strength to do what's necessary. Only purpose. She looked at each of them in turn. Will you help me fulfill my final duty as caretaker? Of course, Jake answered for all of them. What do you need us to do? Help me tell Winterhaven's story, Margaret replied. All of it, at last. Margaret's return to Winterhaven Cottage the following morning created a stir among the preservationists, historians, and media who had maintained a continuous presence on the property. Leaning on Catherine's arm, she moved slowly up the porch steps, her face a complex mixture of emotions as she crossed the threshold into her former home. So many strangers, she murmured, watching researchers carefully cataloging items throughout. The house! They're helping preserve everything, Catherine explained gently. Margaret nodded, then turned to Jake, Carlos, and Elise, who had followed them inside. There's something else you need to see. Something I concealed even from the journals. She led them to the study, moving with surprising confidence for someone who had been away for weeks. At the fireplace, she pressed a specific point on the ornate wooden mantelpiece. A small panel slid open, revealing a keyhole. The brass key, she prompted. Catherine handed her the key from the mother-of-pearl box. Margaret inserted it into the lock and turned it with a decisive click. A section of the bookcase beside the fireplace swung inward, revealing a hidden compartment containing an antique strongbox. The caretaker's vault, Margaret explained. Each generation adds to it. Carlos and Jake carefully lifted out the heavy strongbox and placed it on the study desk. The metal was tarnished but solid, with an elaborate lock mechanism that accepted the same brass key. Open it, Margaret instructed, her voice suddenly tired. Inside lay carefully preserved documents in archival sleeves, organized chronologically. Jake gently lifted out the first folder. These are letters signed by Harriet Tubman, he gasped, reading the contents. Correspondence with Abigail Winters about underground railroad routes and safe houses. Abigail and Harriet were colleagues. Margaret confirmed. The cottage was part of the Eastern Network. Carlos examined another document. This appears to be a letter from Abraham Lincoln, thanking Sarah Winters for nursing soldiers during the Civil War. Dr. Washington, who had joined them, handled each document with reverent care. These are of extraordinary historical value. Deeper in the strongbox, they found more letters from notable historical figures: Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, Eleanor Roosevelt, and others, all connected to the cottage and its caretakers through various social justice movements, spanning generations. There's more, Margaret said, directing them to a leather portfolio near the bottom. Inside were detailed architectural drawings of the cottage, showing modifications made over decades, including the hidden spaces and escape routes. Tucked among these were legal documents, the original property deed from 1856, wills passing the cottage through generations of Winters women, and handwritten covenants reaffirming the sanctuary's purpose. Dr. Washington shook her head in amazement. This collection is priceless. Museums and universities would compete for these materials. That's precisely why they were hidden, Margaret explained. The value was never in the papers themselves, but in the sanctuary they helped create. Professor Hargrove, who had been examining the documents with scholarly precision, looked up. Conservative estimate? The historical documents alone could be worth several $1,000,000. Add the Maria Santos painting and other artifacts, and you're approaching 8 figures. A stunned silence fell over the room. You knew? Elise finally asked Margaret. All these years, you were sitting on a fortune? Margaret smiled faintly. Of course I knew. Every caretaker knows. But the property taxes, the financial pressure, Jake stammered. You could have sold just one of these letters and secured the cottage for decades. At what cost? Margaret countered. Once revealed, the sanctuary would become a museum, a curiosity. Its purpose would end. She sighed. We protected people, not papers. The documents were merely proof of our purpose, insurance against a time when the cottage itself might be threatened. Like now, Carlos said softly. Precisely like now. Margaret agreed. I had intended to reveal this to Catherine when she became caretaker, but my memory. She trailed off, momentarily confused. Before continuing with determination, the time for secrecy has passed. These materials now serve their final purpose, to save Winter Haven itself. Catherine looked stunned. You never told me about this vault. Each caretaker learns in her own time, Margaret replied. Usually at transition. My illness accelerated things. Dr. Washington was already making calls to secure proper archival support. These need climate-controlled storage immediately. And security. A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, they could see Thomas Bennett arguing with security personnel at the property line. He's persistent, Elise observed. He wants what's valuable, Margaret said simply. But he's looking in the wrong direction. Catherine's phone rang. The Historical Society's attorney. After a brief conversation, her expression darkened. Bennett's filed a countersuit claiming all artifacts and historical items are included in the property sale. She looked at her aunt. He's arguing that since you sold the cottage, everything inside belongs to Horizon. Margaret's smile was surprisingly serene. Perfect timing, then, for my final act as caretaker. What do you mean? Jake asked. Margaret's eyes gleamed with clarity. I'm donating the entire collection to the State Historical Society. Effective? Immediately. Thomas Bennett sat alone in his corner office, tie loosened, jacket discarded over a chair. The city lights twinkled below as evening settled, but he took no pleasure in the view that had once represented his success. On his desk lay newspaper clippings, printouts of online articles, and a folder from his legal team, all delivering the same message. Public opinion had turned decisively against Horizon developments. The cottage story had gone national. Preservation. Societies, women's groups, veterans organizations, and art institutions had all rallied to Winter Haven's defense. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls from board members, concerned investors, and reporters seeking comment. A knock interrupted his dark thoughts. His assistant entered without waiting for a response. Sir, there's someone here to see you? She says it's important. Bennett waved dismissively. I'm not taking visitors. She says to tell you it's about your grandfather, Robert Bennett. His head snapped up. Send her in. A minute later, an elderly woman with a cane and sharp eyes entered. Though they'd never met, Bennett recognized her immediately from news footage. Mrs. Winters, he acknowledged, not bothering to stand. I'm surprised to see you here. Margaret approached his desk with measured steps. Mr. Bennett, I believe we should speak privately. Curiosity overrode hostility. Bennett nodded to his assistant, who closed the door behind her. What's this about? My grandfather? He demanded once they were alone. Margaret reached into her handbag and withdrew a worn journal. May 1952 to December 1952, she said, placing it on his desk. My personal journal from that period. Bennett made no move to touch it. And this concerns my grandfather how? Page 43, Margaret replied simply. After a moment's hesitation, Bennett opened the journal to the indicated page. His expression changed as he read, June 17, 1952. Robert B. arrived today, referred by Pastor Williams. Another exhaustion case, though the smell of whiskey tells a different story. Lost his position at the bank last month after the incident with the missing funds. His wife has taken their son and returned to her parents. The man is utterly defeated. Speaking of ending his life, I've given him the east bedroom and removed anything dangerous. Eleanor says we should inform authorities, but I've asked for 2 weeks to help him stabilize. Bennett's hands trembled slightly as he turned the page. June 24, 1952. Robert has begun helping with cottage repairs. The physical labor seems to clear his mind. Spoke today about his shame, his fear of never seeing his son again. I reminded him that redemption begins with a single honest step. July 15, 1952. Robert received a letter from his wife today. She's willing to meet and discuss reconciliation if he remains sober. The transformation in him was immediate. Purpose restored with a few written words. How powerful hope can be. Bennett closed the journal, his face ashen. This can't be right. My grandfather was a respected banker. My father never mentioned. Few men discuss their darkest moments, even with their sons, Margaret observed. Especially with their sons. Why show me this now? Because you should understand what you're trying to destroy, Margaret answered. Your grandfather spent 3 months at Winter Haven recovering from alcoholism and embezzlement charges that were later dropped. He reconciled with your grandmother, rebuilt his career, and became the man you presumably admired. Winter Haven was part of that journey. Bennett stared at the journal, memories realigning with this new information. The cottage. My father used to drive past it sometimes. He'd fall silent just looking at it. I never understood why. Now you do, Margaret said simply. She reached into her bag again and withdrew a small, worn Bible. Your grandfather left this behind. I've kept it, as I've kept many small treasures entrusted to Winter Haven over the years. Bennett opened the Bible to find his grandfather's name inscribed inside, along with a date, August 30th, 1952, and a handwritten note, the day Grace found me again. How do I know this is real? He asked, though his voice lacked conviction. You already know, Margaret replied. Some truths resonate beyond proof. They sat in silence as Bennett absorbed this revelation about his family history. Finally, he spoke. What do you want from me, Mrs. Winters? Nothing you wouldn't want for yourself, if you were thinking clearly, she answered. Your legacy isn't in how many luxury townhomes you build. It's in what you choose to preserve when given the chance to be destructive instead. She rose slowly, leaning on her cane. The town council votes tomorrow on the historical designation. I thought you should have all the facts before then. As she reached the door, Bennett called after her. My grandfather, was he happy after? Margaret turned, her expression softening. He found his way back to himself. Isn't that what happiness ultimately is? She paused. He visited the cottage every Christmas afterward, always leaving an anonymous donation. I assumed you knew. After she left, Bennett sat motionless, the Bible open in his hands. On his computer screen, the demolition orders awaited his final authorization. The cursor blinked, patient and indifferent to his internal struggle. After a long moment, he reached for his phone. Get me Jake Chen, he instructed his assistant, and cancel tomorrow's demolition crew. We're going to need those alternative plans after all. The town hall's meeting room had never seen such a crowd. Every seat was filled, with people standing along the walls and spilling into the hallway. Local news cameras captured the historic gathering as the council prepared to vote on Winter Haven's historical designation. Margaret sat in the front row between Catherine and Carlos's father, Eduardo. Behind them, Elise, Jake, and Carlos exchanged nervous glances. Despite Bennett's apparent change of heart, they'd seen too many corporate pivots to trust completely. Where is he? Jake whispered, scanning the room for Bennett. Elise checked her phone. No messages. The alternative plans are ready if he shows. Mayor Reynolds called the meeting to order, outlining the evening's agenda. Tonight we consider Resolution 157, designating the property known as Winter Haven Cottage as a protected historical site under town jurisdiction. Councilman Porter, once Margaret's critic, now led the presentation supporting designation. This structure represents not just architectural heritage, but a continuous thread of community service spanning over 160 years. His voice carried a conviction absent in previous council meetings. From the Underground Railroad to veterans' rehabilitation, from Depression-era community support to sheltering those in crisis, Winter Haven embodies our town's highest values. Dr. Washington presented the historical evidence, while Professor Hargrove explained the national significance of the site. Harold Fisher, the elderly man who had received food during the Depression, spoke movingly about Catherine Winter's kindness. As public comments began, a murmur swept through the crowd. Thomas Bennett had arrived, immaculately dressed but uncharacteristically subdued. He made his way to the podium when his turn came to speak. Many of you know me as the developer who planned to demolish Winter Haven Cottage, he began, his voice steady despite the hostile murmurs. You're not wrong to view me as the villain in this story. The room quieted, surprised by his candor. I've built my career creating homes that showcase status rather than substance, Bennett continued. I measured success by profit margins and square footage. In pursuing that vision, I nearly destroyed something irreplaceable. He removed his grandfather's Bible from his jacket and held it up. My own grandfather found sanctuary at Winter Haven in 1952. Like countless others, he rebuilt his life within those walls. Had I succeeded in demolishing the cottage, I would have erased not just history, but part of my own family's story. Bennett turned to address Margaret directly. Mrs. Winters, I owe you an apology. Your family's legacy deserves better than what I offered. Returning his attention to the council, Bennett announced, Horizon Developments is withdrawing all legal challenges to historical designation. Furthermore, we're donating the adjacent land parcel we purchased last year to expand the Winter Haven preservation area. Gasps and whispers filled the room. Instead of 12 townhomes, we propose building 4 custom residences on the far edge of the property, with architectural elements that complement rather than compete with Winter Haven. All construction proceeds will establish an endowment for the cottage's ongoing preservation. Jake leaned toward Elise. That's even better than our alternative plan. Bennett wasn't finished. Finally, Horizon will fund the restoration of Winter Haven to its original condition, with modifications only as needed to function as a living museum and community center. As Bennett returned to his seat, the crowd erupted in applause. Mayor Reynolds struggled to restore order before calling for additional comments. Person after person approached the podium. Longtime residents, historians, veterans, artists, and former critics of the cottage, all speaking in favor of preservation. Caroline Mason, the power-walking neighbor who had once wrinkled her nose at the eyesore, offered a particularly poignant statement. I've lived across from Winter Haven for 20 years without understanding its significance. I judged by appearances rather than substance, a mistake I won't make again. When public comments concluded, Mayor Reynolds called for the vote. The resolution passed unanimously, triggering a standing ovation that lasted several minutes as the crowd began to disperse. Catherine helped Margaret to her feet. Bennett approached them hesitantly. Is your offer genuine? Margaret asked, studying his face. Completely, Bennett affirmed. The paperwork is already with your attorney. Margaret extended her hand. Then perhaps you understand the cottage's purpose after all. Bennett accepted her handshake with visible emotion. I'm beginning to. Outside the town hall, citizens had gathered with candles, creating an impromptu celebration. A handmade banner stretched across the street. Winter Haven, preserved for
generations. Look, Carlos said softly, pointing to the growing crowd. People from every segment of the community had come together. Elderly residents sharing stories with teenagers, wealthy homeowners standing shoulder to shoulder with service.
Workers, families from every background united in celebration. The cottage has done it again, Jake observed, creating community from chaos. Elise nodded, professional detachment finally giving way to genuine pride. Sometimes preservation isn't just about saving buildings. No, Margaret agreed, watching the gathering with bright eyes. It's about preserving possibility. 6 months later, Winter Haven Cottage stood transformed. Gone were the peeling paint and sagging porch boards, replaced by meticulously restored period-appropriate details. The garden, once Margaret's solitary domain, now flourished under the care of community volunteers led by Carlos, who had incorporated his grandfather's rose cultivation techniques. Inside the cottage, rooms had been thoughtfully preserved while accommodating their new purpose as a living museum. The kitchen where Catherine Winters had once fed the hungry during the Depression now hosted cooking classes focused on sustainable nutrition. The parlor where Eleanor had counseled traumatized veterans served as a meeting space for support groups. The hidden room beneath the kitchen floor had been stabilized and made accessible for guided tours, bearing witness to the Underground Railroad's dangerous path to freedom. Jake stood on the front lawn, reviewing architectural plans with Bennett. Their unlikely partnership had evolved into mutual respect over months of collaboration. "The pergola placement looks good," Jake said, pointing to the garden blueprint. "It references the original structure from the 1920s without overwhelming the cottage sightlines." Bennett nodded, his former corporate rigidity softened by genuine engagement with the project. "What about the accessibility ramp?" "Here," Jake indicated a gently curving path that would provide wheelchair access while blending with the landscape. "Same natural stone as the garden walls, so it feels integrated rather than added on." Nearby, Elise coordinated with historians and craftspeople, her project management skills now directed toward preservation rather than development. She had surprised everyone, perhaps even herself, by leaving Horizon to become Winter Haven's first executive director. "The original window glass is salvageable for the front facade," she was explaining to a restoration specialist. "We'll use period-appropriate reproductions for the rest." From the porch, Margaret watched these activities with quiet satisfaction. Though she now lived permanently at Oakridge Senior Living, she visited weekly to advise on restoration details and share stories for the oral history project. Catherine had established a foundation to manage the cottage, ensuring its mission would continue under proper governance. Dr. Washington approached Margaret with a tablet displaying the museum layout. "We've organized the exhibits chronologically, with space for rotating displays, highlighting different aspects of Winter Haven's history. Does this arrangement seem appropriate?" Margaret studied the plans, her once sharp mind still capable of surprising clarity. "The flow works well, but consider creating more intimate spaces for reflection." Winter Haven was never about displaying history. It was about living it. The observation sparked a productive discussion about balancing historical preservation with the cottage's living legacy. This delicate balance had become the project's guiding principle, honoring the past while serving present needs. Caroline Mason, once the cottage's harshest critic, now led the community docent program. "We've had over 300 volunteer applications," she reported enthusiastically to Catherine. "Everyone wants to be involved." "Screen for commitment, not just enthusiasm," Catherine advised. "Winter Haven's story requires respect, not sensation." The 4 custom homes taking shape at the property's edge reflected Jake's thoughtful design, architecturally distinctive yet harmonious with the historic cottage. Unlike Bennett's original cookie-cutter townhomes, each residence incorporated sustainable features and design elements referencing Winter Haven's craftsman details. Bennett himself had purchased one, a decision that raised eyebrows until he explained his intention to establish a residency program for artists and writers needing sanctuary, a modern continuation of the cottage's tradition. As evening approached, community members gathered for the monthly sunset potluck that had become a neighborhood tradition. Councilman Porter, who had once dismissed Margaret as the old bat, now regularly brought his famous peach cobbler. Eduardo Jimenez shared stories of his father with younger veterans seeking connection. Dr. Chen from the Art Museum discussed plans for an exhibition featuring Maria Santos and other artists who had found refuge at Winter Haven. Margaret sat in a place of honor, receiving visitors with grace despite her increasingly frequent memory lapses. When a young journalist asked what she considered Winter Haven's greatest achievement, she smiled thoughtfully. "Winter Haven never achieved anything," she corrected gently. "People did. The cottage simply provided space for possibility." Later, as twilight settled over the gathering, Jake found Elise watching the scene with uncharacteristic sentimentality. "Having regrets about leaving corporate development?" he teased. She shook her head. "Just thinking about what almost happened. We nearly erased all this without ever knowing what we were destroying." "But we didn't," Jake reminded her. "Sometimes the system works." "Not the system," Elise corrected. "People willing to stand against it when necessary." Across the lawn, Bennett was deep in conversation with Carlos about indigenous plants for the butterfly garden. Margaret watched them with knowing eyes, another piece of her legacy falling quietly into place. "The caretaker tradition continues," she murmured to Catherine. "Just differently than we imagined. Is that all right?" Catherine asked softly. Margaret nodded, her gaze encompassing the entire gathering. Better, perhaps. Some traditions need to evolve to survive. 1 year to the day after the town council's historic vote, Winterhaven Cottage officially opened to the public. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the restored exterior as a crowd gathered on the front lawn. TV crews positioned cameras while local officials adjusted their ties and checked speeches. Margaret Winters, now 85, sat in a wheelchair at the center of the front row. Though her Alzheimer's had progressed, today her eyes were clear and focused, taking in every detail of the cottage's transformation. Catherine stood protectively beside her, the brass key hanging from a ribbon around her neck, a symbol of her role as the new official caretaker. Mayor Reynolds approached the podium set up on the porch. Today, we don't just open a museum, we acknowledge a legacy of compassion that has shaped our community for generations. He gestured toward Margaret. And we honor the woman who preserved this legacy when no one else understood its value. Applause swept through the crowd as Catherine wheeled Margaret forward. With trembling hands, Margaret accepted the ceremonial scissors and cut the ribbon, stretched across the porch steps. Cheers erupted as the doors officially opened, welcoming visitors to explore Winterhaven's carefully curated exhibits. Inside, the transformation was complete. Each room told part of Winterhaven's story through artifacts, photographs, and interactive displays. The Underground Railroad room featured recorded narratives describing the dangerous journey to freedom. The Veterans Recovery space included Francisco Jimenez's gardening tools and journal entries documenting his healing. The Depression-era kitchen displayed Catherine Winter's recipe book alongside oral histories from community members who had received meals there. In the parlor, now, serving as the main exhibition hall, Maria Santos's unfinished painting held a place of honor. Beside it hung a newly commissioned work she had created specifically for the opening. A vibrant canvas showing the cottage surrounded by figures representing all who had found sanctuary there over generations. A guest book stood open on an antique desk, its first page already filled with signatures from all who had helped save Winterhaven, the development team, historians, community volunteers, town officials, and at the top, Margaret's careful handwriting. Bennett, now serving on the Winterhaven Foundation Board, moved through the crowd with uncharacteristic humility. He stopped beside Jake, who was explaining the architectural restoration process to visitors. "We did something worthwhile here," Bennett said quietly. Jake nodded. "First time I've been proud of a project after completion, not just during design." "Won't be the last," Bennett replied. "The foundation has identified 2 more historic properties at risk in neighboring counties. I was hoping you'd consult." Across the room, Carlos led a tour group that included his father and several veterans from the local VA hospital. "My grandfather found healing in this very room," he explained. "Now we're establishing a garden therapy program for returning service members, continuing Winterhaven's tradition of supporting veterans." Elise, efficiently managing the logistics of the opening celebration, paused to watch Margaret being wheeled through the exhibits. Despite her illness, Margaret acknowledged each display with recognition, occasionally offering details the historians had missed. As the afternoon progressed, the crowd thinned, leaving only the core group who had fought for Winterhaven's preservation. They gathered on the back porch, sharing quiet conversation as the sun began to set. "I have something for each of you," Margaret announced suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. Catherine brought forward a small basket containing smooth stones, each painted with a single word: courage, vision, persistence, compassion. "A tradition from Eleanor's time," Margaret explained as she distributed the stones. "Tokens to remember that transformation often begins with just one person willing to see differently." As twilight settled over Winterhaven, Margaret asked to be left alone on the porch for a few minutes. The others respected her wish, moving inside while keeping watch through the window. In the gathering dusk, Margaret closed her eyes, her hands resting on the wheelchair arms that had once been porch railings, repurposed by Carlos in a fitting symbol of renewal. She breathed deeply, taking in the sense of garden soil and old wood, committing them to whatever part of memory Alzheimer's couldn't touch. When they came to check on her, They found her smiling peacefully. "It's complete now," she said simply. The circle continues. As if responding to her words, the porch light flickered on automatically, illuminating the path for a young woman making her way hesitantly up the front walk. She paused at the bottom step, clutching a small suitcase, her face bearing the unmistakable look of someone in need of sanctuary. Catherine stepped forward, the brass key gleaming in the porch light. "Welcome to Winter Haven," she said, opening the door. "You're safe here,